Good evening and welcome to this Policy Exchange event on implementation and getting big things done in government. Some of you in the room probably may have already seen our star speaker this evening speak earlier on in the week at the First Bureaucratic Age Conference. For those of you who didn't see him, Bill Eggers doesn't really need much introduction. He was the leader of the Texas Performance Review, which managed to find a cool $2 billion worth of savings out of the state's budget. He went on to be an advisor to the Office of Budget. He is currently at Deloitte. He's the author of several kind of intriguing books. He wrote, amongst other things, Governing by Network, Government 2.0, which is about IT in government, and most recently of all, If We Can Put a Man on the Moon, which is about, as it says, getting big things done in government. So we're going to start with a presentation from Bill, and then we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A. So without further ado, thank you for coming to Policy Exchange, Bill Eggers.
Thank you very much, and Neil, thanks so much for the invitation. I've heard so much about Policy Exchange over the last few years, and everyone keeps on telling me it's the hottest think tank in London. So it's really great to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this book, and one of the questions everyone always asks me is, well, how did you come up with that title? But the title was because think about that phrase, if we can put a man on the moon. How many times have you heard that phrase? If we can put a man on the moon, why can't we cure homelessness? If we can put a man on the moon, why can't we fix our schools or cure cancer? Or for my favorite news source, The Onion, if we can put a man on the moon, why can't we make killer robot police? Now, this didn't start off as a cliche. It started off as a challenge issued by President John F. Kennedy in 1961. And let's see if we can hear it from him. Freezing up with the...
Here we go.
Here we go. We don't have it. It's not going to be. So when he issued his challenge, which is putting man on the moon by the end of the decade, it was an impossible challenge, really. At the time, people just said, "There's no way we can do this." But we pulled together, and in 1969, Neil Armstrong planted the flag on the moon. And at the time, it led to all sorts of celebrations and ticker tape parades, and throughout kind of the Western democracies, there's this real feeling of optimism at the time. Between the Marshall Plan and winning World War II and a variety of other things, a big feeling of optimism. Now the question is, do we still have that sort of optimism today? Is government still able to execute? Government as our society, our country is still able to execute on our most important challenges. And that's why we wrote this book, to try to answer that question. We asked that question to senior executives, in many different countries, and the answer was actually kind of interesting. A lot of them said we're not as capable of executing today as we were 20, 30 years ago. And so one of the questions we wanted to ask in the book is why? How do you tell the difference between success and failure? And that's what the book was about. Why do some big initiatives succeed and why do some fail? Very, very simple question that we wanted to ask. And when we set out to answer this question, we said we want to study a lot of different initiatives. We don't want to make it just anecdotal. And so we actually examined over 75 major initiatives since World War II. We looked at everything from Japanese postal privatization to London congestion pricing. We looked at wars on poverty and wars on inflation to real wars in Iraq and Vietnam. And what we were seeking to do was have a systematic way of looking at the difference between success and failure. What are the key requirements to do that? Now, when we started this process, it was my co-author is the MIT process engineer who's now at the Kennedy School, and he's run government departments. But we said to do all of this, to analyze all these initiatives, we can't do it ourselves. We need kind of an army of thoughtful, intelligent individuals who knew government and were willing to work for free. And the answer soon became clear. And I don't know if you had the same answer, Neil. The answer was we needed grad students. And we ended up involving over 70 graduate students in analyzing these initiatives for us over time from many different schools. And let me look at a little bit some of what the initiatives are. We examined everything from policy initiatives to regulatory initiatives, reform and transformation ones. We looked at a lot of examples of government when they try to make markets and everything, because that's a very, very difficult thing. We see a lot of that happening. IT process improvement. Why do so many big IT initiatives seem to fail? What is there? What is it? What can we learn from those? Capital projects, peacekeeping, and defense. And for each of these, we usually had at least 7 or 8 different ones that we analyzed. So we could look at kind of success and failure. Now, as I mentioned, my co-author, being a process engineer, looks at the world in that certain way. And so what we decided to do is we were going to actually break these initiatives down into their discrete processes. And what we found was that while everything from going to war to deregulation, they seem so different, but in fact, once you break them down into their discrete processes, there's actually some real similarities to them. And what we found was that there's lots of different ways an initiative can end in failure, but to actually have a happy ending, certain things need to happen. You need to start with a good idea. You need to have an implementable design, a design that actually works in the real world. It needs to win democratic approval. And usually going through Parliament, sometimes a council, sometimes an executive order. We call that going through the Stargate. So anyone ever seen that science fiction movie, the Stargate? And if you remember the Stargate, there's a giant wormhole in space, right? And when you step through the Stargate, you actually go from one world to another, and you can't get back. And in many respects, in the public policy world, the Stargate is kind of the wall between the political and policy process over here and kind of the bureaucratic process over here. And that stark separation creates some real problems. Now, this Stargate is much bigger and a much bigger problem in a system like the US than in a Westminster system. But I've been here a number of days and spent some time in Canada and Australia speaking on the book. And the feeling is that the Stargate is still problematic because it creates some real dissonance. You need to then have good implementation, you need to generate results, and then you need to go back through and reevaluate that initiative, because no matter how good it was at the beginning and how well it worked, over time, it makes less and less sense. We don't do a very good job of systemically reevaluating these initiatives. One of the things that happens in government is that we start up lots of new initiatives and we never kind of end existing ones. And what the executives told us and others was that ends up creating a lot of problems because they have to devote a lot of their managerial talent and focus to things that are already existing, right? And so that becomes, we have a whole kind of chapter on how do you actually go about the reevaluation and redesign of the process. Now, I come about this, look at it a little bit different way as a consultant. Consultants are often called in when the cart is in the ditch, when things are kind of going wrong, and I'm also a bit of a pessimist. And so while this map, is very clean, we know in the real world it's not that clean. It's a little bit more rocky. And what we found was that failure kind of lurks at every stage of this journey. And we actually identified 7 what we call hidden pitfalls, or 7 deadly traps on the way to success here. I'm not going to go through all of them today. We're going to go through a couple of them. To actually, if you want to read about all of them, you're going to actually have to read the book, which means you have to buy the book, and it's available for a bargain price of what?
20 pounds.
20 pounds. And then I'll actually sign it, which means it'll reduce its value a little bit. But and so I'm going to go through just a couple of these, and then in Q&A we can talk about them some more. But real quickly, these ones I'll talk about. A couple ones I won't. The complacency trap is really this notion of what's there prevents us from seeing what can be and it's where we don't continually reevaluate initiatives over time, where we don't have a good job of kind of doing redesign. And very, very big problem in government. As you're facing these budget deficits, this is one of the things you have to get really, really good at. We examined over 25 transformation initiatives to see how do you do that better. The silo trap, really big issue, is that if you look at this journey, now in the private sector, if someone asks, if I come up with a great idea, I'm then going to be on the hook for mostly to take it all the way through. I can't just say I'm the idea guy and I'm going to pass my ideas on to others. But in the public policy process and in government, no one owns this whole journey. When you think about it, who owns this journey in government today? You've got policy people maybe owning this part of the journey. Maybe this part, the idea might be the minister and the staff. The design might be some of the strategy in it. And then you've got people doing implementation over here, another group doing reevaluation. And so without anyone owning the full journey, you have these silos. People are only seeing their pieces, and sometimes that success means just getting something through Parliament. And that creates a lot of problems. So the silos is not only the silos between agencies, but silos between this initiative. This is an integrated process. It needs to be treated as such, but it's not often. The ones that were successful did have that, and we didn't have all that kind of gaps between those areas. So that's the general framework, and when you combine those map traps with the map, the real journey to success actually looks a little bit more like this, where you've got the land of the political over here, the realm of bureaucracy, the different traps along the way, and it's a very, very treacherous journey. And so it's really easy. I spent my first couple of years doing policy, and it's really easy to come up with really good things in the policy that look really good, but actually getting them all the way through to result is a whole different world. And that's what we wanted to look at, was how do we integrate this? What's the full journey? When we started writing the book, we went to the bookstores and everything, and we found that there's all these books on public affairs, there's some books on policy, maybe a book or two in implementation, but the books were even completely different. And the policy people, people who write about policy don't really write about implementation and vice versa. So what we're trying to do is bring that all together in this book. So let's look at a few stages. Let's start off with the idea stage. And not all ideas are created equal. There's a lot of bad ideas out there. The Hobocopter was a bad idea. And that had a patent, by the way. Another bad idea was New Coke, if you remember that. The electric fork was another bad idea. And a really, really bad idea was back in the 1970s. And if you remember, in America, we tried to fight inflation through with inflation now buttons. It was after wage and price controls didn't quite work. We decided we were going to try this, and that became an official policy out of the White House. And we read about this actually in the book. It's a true story how in the world this happened. So how does a really terrible idea like that become reality? It's when they're not exposed to external criticism, when they're not exposed to diversity of views. And we call this the Tolstoy trap, named after Count Leo Tolstoy, who wrote about how people see only what they want to see often. They ignore evidence that contradicts with their hypotheses. It's the exact opposite of the scientific method, but that's how things often operate in the political world, right? One of the stories we tell is about a number of years ago, a professor out of Georgia got together, he studies how the brain works and also looks at politics, and so he got together in the US ardent Democrats, ardent Republicans into a room to watch a debate between George Bush and John Kerry when they were running against each other for president. And there was a twist though. He wanted to kind of see how their brain was working, so he wired them up to an MRI machine. And what he found was that while they're watching the debate, those Bush supporters thought that Bush won. They ignored when Bush was being inconsistent, and the same thing for Kerry. That's no big surprise, but what was surprising was that the thinking part of the brain, the part that was actually thinking, was not even activated during the debate. It wasn't going. It was only the emotional part of the brain. They were just pulling for their guy. They weren't thinking at all. And in America today, right now, and this is our political process. Okay? This is how everything is going on today, where people are completely unable to kind of view the other side. And the problem with that is that you end up with a lot of bad ideas because they're not subject to that kind of analytical criticism of the diversity of ideas. And so what we say you need to do is actually go out and actively seek out critics. We have in the back of each chapter what we call the field guides. And these are a whole bunch of tools and techniques you can use to get through those stages. And in this case, there's a lot of great tools and techniques. Neil was mentioning at the conference on post-bureaucratic governance, we talked a lot about some of the technology tools, like using things like crowdsourcing, which means that you want to reach out to many and try to aggregate the wisdom of individuals. Another example is to, instead of what we call opposite of an idea result, we have something in the use called the X Prize, where they're giving money, a private foundation, for whoever can create a vehicle that goes over 100 miles per, has over 100 miles per gallon. They're paying for a result. And these are all different ways of kind of breaking out of that typical kind of policy process. So let me give you a quick story about one example, which was one of the biggest environmental issues in North America in the 1970s and 80s. And that issue was acid rain. I grew up outside of Chicago. We lived about a mile from Lake Michigan. We loved going to the beach, and we're always begging my mom to take us to the beach, but we could never go because she didn't want us to be stepping all over dead fish, which would cover our beach. Why are the fish dead? Because of acid rain. Acid rain, of course, occurs when coal-burning plants kind of blow the acid, the pollutants up into the atmosphere. They float into the clouds. They usually float about 100, 200 miles, and then they come down somewhere else. This was a really big issue in the 1970s and 80s, because if you lived where the acid rain was coming down, you weren't too happy about it. And a lot of the acid rain was actually coming down in Canada as in coming up in the US, and so it was a very, very big kind of international issue between the countries. So people kind of agreed that this was a problem, but nothing was being done about it. Why? Because you had environmentalists on one side who basically wanted to eliminate all pollution. You had industry, coal producers on the other side who believed that regulation was going to put them out of work and maybe bankrupt them. So you had an impasse. 70 bills were authored in Congress to deal with acid rain in the 1980s. Not a single one made it through. Brian Mulroney had a whole summit with Ronald Reagan trying to do something about acid rain. Nothing happened. So they were at an impasse. The two sides didn't just argue with each other, they hated each other. They despised each other. They weren't talking at all. Into this logjam stepped two senators, Democrat Tim Wirth from Colorado, environmentalist, Jack Hines from the Heinz ketchup fortune from Pennsylvania, who was a Republican representing that state. And what they did was, into that room of environmentalists and business interests, they brought someone different to look at this issue, economists. Now, economists look at trade-offs. They look at all these things. By the way, are there any economists in the room at all? Two economists? Do you mind if I tell an economist joke?
Heard them all before.
You know what they, okay. You know what they say about economists, don't you? They're very good with numbers, but they lack the personality to become engineers. So, my engineer co-author loves to tell that one. But economists are actually the heroes of this, because what they did was they looked at trade-offs, they looked at it in a different way, they came up with an innovative solution, which was essentially to cap the amount of pollution at half the previous rate, but instead of a command and control approach, they were going to let the market decide how to get under that 50% reduction. And so rather than having the Environmental Protection Agency or others, so the producers were able to come up with all sorts of means. Now, neither side loved it, but it was workable, it was simple, it actually changed the political calculus, and George Bush the first actually signed the bill, and the results were 40% reduction in sulfur dioxide emissions, 40 to 1 cost benefit ratio. It ended up being really the biggest environmental success of, one of the biggest environmental successes of recent decades. And again, what they did was they brought new voices into it, and they're able to break through that impasse. We found example after example of these kind of mashups in a way where you're able to take an idea from one side, an idea from another side, put them together in a new way to break through and come up with a solution. So let's look at, so that's the key insight, bring the diversity of views into the ideation process. Had a lot of discussions with senior civil servants about this and ways of doing this over the last couple of days. And it's something we don't do enough of today. And there's a lot of tools that allow us to do so. So let's look at the design phase. The biggest trap in the design phase is what we call the design for design trap. And that's where we basically design policy that works in the political world but doesn't work in the real world. And this is a very, very big problem, actually. And I'm going to take you, tell a real quick story. Now, after the UK deregulated electricity, and after we had seen kind of deregulation of trucking and airlines in the US, that was kind of a big hot word back in the 1990s. And California at the time was facing big unemployment. They were facing big energy, high energy costs, and they kind of looked around and they said, you know, maybe what we should do is look at deregulation. We can lower energy costs. You had a lot of kind of free market think tanks who were pushing this issue. And it's not a crazy idea. It worked in other industries, but the key was going to be the design of the deregulation. Now, the design that they actually ended up coming up with was really, 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 really complicated. In fact, it was so complicated that almost no one actually understood how it worked, including most of the legislators who ended up voting on it. But there was a group of individuals, mostly engineers, a couple of economists, from a certain Houston energy company who did figure out how this system worked. Any guesses on who they are? Enron. Enron came up with a lot of ways to profit from the loopholes in the system. They had cute names like Ricochet, and Fat Boy, and Death Star. And in one case, because electricity travels at the speed of light. So in one case, what they did was they took the juice and they shipped it out through Nevada, up through Oregon, back into California again, and they actually made a profit from doing so without it ever essentially going anywhere. Okay, and again, this happened again and again. They were making billions of dollars off this, and other companies were. Meanwhile, they hadn't built any more energy plants. And so this went into effect in 1998. The bill had been passed in 96. 2 years later, a huge heat wave in California. Northern California, some of the hottest temperatures you'd ever had, and then the lights went out. California started experiencing this weird phenomenon of rolling blackouts. Silicon Valley, the kind of the high-tech capital of the world, had essentially the electricity supply of a third world nation. Companies like Intel and others were having to use portable generators to actually keep things going. And this went on for months and months. I was living there at the time. It was absolutely crazy to be there. You didn't know when they were coming, and they would come for a period of time. And so it ended up costing consumers about $40 billion, consumers and California taxpayers. Gray Davis, who was the governor at the time, was thrown out of office for this, even that he wasn't there when the design came, but he was there when it hit. This is that Arnold Schwarzenegger was ushered in based on this. So huge repercussions to this. So then the question is, how did such a badly designed bill, a poorly designed bill, actually become law? And that's where it becomes very scary, is because they had an exemplary process for doing the bill drafting. They had hearings. They sent a delegation out here to the UK to look at how it was done here. Bipartisan process, cooperation, was actually passed 98-0, which nothing ever in the California legislature was passed like that. So what happened? Well, they were designing a bill that would pass, and they were designing a bill based, and so they added a lot of different goodies for various industries and so forth. But what happened was all the pieces then didn't actually fit together. And they were designing a bill that could work in the political world and the policy world, but it wasn't Enron-proof, essentially. No one had actually ever get the Enron traders and others together and try to war game this and just see actually how people would react to these things in the real world. And the reason I give this story is it turns out that as we looked at initiative after initiative, a lot of the implementation failures that we found were actually design failures, the root of them. We had a great meeting today, and one of the participants was talking about how in one of the kind of the major IT problems with the Child Welfare Agency over time, and people have been looking at problems for many years, and he actually, when you looked at it, actually, it wasn't really IT issues. The problem was actually how the design of the actual initial system was and the incentives there. So we found senior executives, every country we've talked to so far, they've said that this is a huge problem. 67% of Canadian officials say there's often or always a disconnect between designers and implementers. In the US, only 16% of the SDS said that the Fed's design policy that can actually be implemented. The voices of frustration. This was just in Canada, which again, a Westminster system, which you can see real frustration, feeling that this disconnect between design and implementation, and the feeling that that disconnect has actually grown over time, at the same time the private sector where they've tried to reduce it down. Now, I'm not sure that it's a big problem here, but I think it's a problem. Every single meeting we've had, they've had a lot of issues about this. Now, there's lots of ways you can fix this. And the first thing is you want to focus on workability during the design process. You want to basically do a lot of, because all of these initiatives, when they hit the real world, are going to be much different than when you're kind of doing the policy white papers and the green papers. And what you want to be doing is a lot of prototyping, a lot of scenario analysis, and a lot of that stuff where you're trying them out, iterations at a small piece during the design process as opposed to waiting until implementation. Getting all those kinks out and seeing how people will really react to it. So an example being, right now there's a lot of talk about how do we get people to essentially conserve more energy here, right? And so what we might want to do is put on pieces of, let people see how their neighbors were doing in terms of the use of energy, right? Or we might want to put thermos, different kind of things in people's actually houses to see how much energy they're using on a regular basis. Well, we don't know whether those are going to work or not. Before anything like that you do nationwide, you have to make sure to test them out. Because it may turn out that people don't really care what their neighbors, if their neighbors are seeing this, what their neighbors are doing. But testing all this out in the real world in smaller ways and doing it quickly, which we can do now, is really the key to ensuring that we don't have these bigger failures later. The key thing is you want to fail small and fail fast, and do that during the design process. You reduce your risk dramatically. Let me tell one last story, and we'll go to the launch side, which is real implementation. And I told a lot of this stuff early because everyone says, well, I just want to care about implementation. I don't know why, but the problem is if you do all this other stuff poorly, it doesn't matter how well you do implementation because it's always over, okay? And so this story is a familiar one to all of you, and we devoted a whole chapter to it because it's a wonderful story. And that's looking at congestion charging in London. Now, some of you are going to love the idea, some of you are going to hate the idea, right? But I want you to just to think about it. What I'm going to tell the story of is how do they actually get it done? And what are some of those lessons learned from that? The biggest trap in the kind of the launch phase is the overconfidence trap, which is that in the political world, it's this, you always hear failure is not an option, right? Failure is absolutely not. Well, failure is always an option. And we're always overconfident that we can get these things done. Look at big IT projects, look at other things. And to avoid failure, what you want to do is take failure seriously. Take it really seriously at every level. So congestion pricing here, when it had been on the drawing board in many, many cities for many years. Economists had written about it forever. But it failed to get past the Stargate again and again. It was very, very politically difficult. And then, of course, you had Livingston's election, and he pledged during the election to implement the congestion charging scheme. Now, the thing about this is, if you remember, there's so many different ways this could have blown up. You had to do it all at once, not street by street. It had never been done anywhere in the world at this scale before. Singapore would have been done years ago. Well, they don't have a Stargate, they don't have a political process, they kind of just do it, right? And the majority of Londoners at the time were slightly against doing this. And so, if you recall, so after the election, his political advisor said, don't do it. And remember the media at the time when he decided to do it? This was some of the headlines from the media. My favorite line was from, in the Guardian newspaper at the time, there was a rabbi who was quoted as saying, "My synagogue was bombed in the war, but Livingston is going to do more damage than the Germans." So that was what he's facing. So a lot of other people would have stopped, but he didn't panic. But what they did was they took failure seriously. And they did a lot of smart things. The smartest thing that they did, first of all, he looked around and said, who knows the streets of London the best of anyone, and who is strong enough to get this through? He picked a guy named Derek Turner, who had worked for Transport for London for a long time. He was known as kind of an abrasive guy and wasn't popular with everyone. But as the mayor told me, that he was one of those guys who was so stubborn and everything. He needed someone so stubborn who would get it through and would not take no for an answer. So he found that person, and what Derek could also do was bridge the political and the bureaucratic worlds. And then what they did was, months before the actual launch, they started doing a lot of kind of testing and planning and testing again. And all in respect, they did a tremendous amount of stakeholder kind of work, where originally the theater owners, right? You guys didn't like the idea, did you? Why didn't you like it?
I think it's going to keep people away from
Right. And so it was pretty strong opposition. What did they do? What did they do to reduce your opposition? Do you remember?
I don't remember.
They basically decided that it was going to be, yes, instead of ending at 7 o'clock or something, it was going to end at 6:30. People who lived within the zone, a lot of them didn't like the idea, said they wouldn't be charged. Various councils who were going to possibly try to kill it, they were given capital improvements and this and that. So a lot of that work changed some of the design around. But what they also did was they did a lot of this testing, and then they also had a simple design. So the technology that they used was not the latest technology. Using cameras and everything, we had much more advanced technology, but it had never been tried and tested and worked on that scale before. The cameras were already there. It's a really key thing. And with those of us, I've been writing about congestion pricing for a long time, and other experts, they all would say, well, what you want to do is you want to charge people kind of by the minute depending on congestion. But they said, again, that's too complicated. We're going to keep it simple, stupid, and this thing, and so they just made it a flat charge. Now, making a lot of those decisions actually in retrospect were really, really key. And the other thing that they did was, remember I talked a lot about the design sort of and the implementation gap? Well, the people who actually wrote the original report for roll call back during the campaign were long-time kind of transportation experts from London who had done implementation. Well, those were all the same people that actually were in charge of implementation of this mission. So they made a number of, I think, those right decisions. The other thing they did was they tested and they planned, and they did a lot of wargaming. It was about a month before they were about to go live. And what they did was that they did a dry run. They wanted to put the control room to the test. And so their day of war games started at 7 a.m. and they would get calls all day long to respond to crises. One of them, they sat down for coffee and they said a major traffic accident has caused a huge bottleneck on a road bordering the zone. Well, the team was ready for it. They had vehicles entering the zone at the detour site were electronically flagged and they won't be charged. 8 a.m. Another call came in. The communications between the cameras and the hubs had broken down. There's no way to track vehicles coming into the zone. The team determines there's a breakdown in the hub. Fixing it will take a couple hours, but they've got a backup computer system that they go to. The majority of drivers should be detected. 9 a.m. Someone has jumped off the tower bridge. And all day long, that was a real call. All day long it went like that, but the team was able to handle everything thrown at them. They were ready. But just in case, a couple days before the launch, they sent a woman named Kate. Kate was actually a colleague of mine because we did that implementation. Kate was sent around to walk the entire 26 miles of the zone with a pad of paper, with sneakers on there. Why? She wanted to make sure nothing was going to happen on the road network without them knowing about it. No public work scaffolding, no hole about to be dug. And just what they also did was they made sure to do the launch on a holiday, so there wasn't going to be as many people there. And I thought, you know, whether you love him or hate him, one thing you have to admit about Ken Livingstone is kind of a brilliant political mind and pretty crafty, right? So if you recall, he had an interview about a week before this, and I can't remember what paper it was, but they asked him a question: what's it going to be like? How's it going to be? And remember the comment that he had? It's going to be bloody. And describing what happened. So he lowered expectations. And so it's 5:30 a.m., it's the day of the launch. And the mayor steps outside of his flat and is greeted by flash, 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 flash. Just all these photographers who are standing there because they want to catch the mayor on the day that they believe is going to be his Waterloo. Everyone's kind of convinced that it was going to be chaos, right? What did you all think? You think it was going to go well? How many people believe that was going to go really smoothly and well? Okay? No one. But it wasn't chaos, in fact, but triumph. Everything went smoothly. There wasn't really a single technical glitch. The streets were eerily empty that day. Talking to Derek, they were watching it all in the video cameras, and no one was coming into death. Livingston had scared everyone away with his comment. And so what happened was they were worried that how are they going to pay for this now? Because no one's going to ever come. Derek said, he said, no one's going to ever come to downtown London again. You know? And people did come back. And remember the doom and gloom headlines. Here are the headlines the day after the launch. He told me it was one of the best political days of his life. And the mayor, as he said to me, that nothing he'd ever done in public life turned out better than he hoped for until this. And it's a pretty successful launch. And if that first couple of days had gone poorly, you're dead in the water with something like that. So the lesson is accepting the possibility of failure, you can avoid failure, and you do all that risk management. Let's look at kind of 7 key elements for success. Diversity of views through the process, design the policy to work in the real world, not just to pass the legislature. You want to have a thoughtful legislative debate, avoid your idea being overly distorted in a political process, taking failure seriously. Almost all the initiatives that we found that were successful had the presence of a bridger, someone who could bridge the political and the bureaucratic worlds. So in this case, it was Derek Turner. Putting a man on the moon, it was a guy named James Webb. And originally when Kennedy asked Webb to head this up, he'd been head of the Bureau of the Budget. Kennedy said, I want to put a man on the moon by 1967. And Webb said, I'm only going to sign up if you change that to by the end of the decade. Because he knows that things always go wrong. And in fact, there was a fire that ended up happening. And then what happened was he asked his people, how much is this going to cost? It came back and they gave him a cost. And there's always an engineering bias to kind of lower that cost. And he said, okay, I'll sign up, but we have to double the overall cost. It came in right around on budget and right beforehand. So he was a guy who understood the terrain and he could talk to the political world and other things. Derek Turner was a guy who wasn't afraid to go head to head and be yelling at Ken Livingstone. And he wasn't afraid of the politicians. And you need kind of people who can speak truth to power and these things. We don't have enough of them today. Special relationship between the politician and implementer, we found that time and time again. Dedicated unit to manage it. Oftentimes, they try to do these big initiatives as day jobs for people, or they just assign people who happen to be in that space who are not necessarily capable of doing it. They don't have the background. What they did here was that they walled off this group. A TFL called them fortress congestion pricing, and he walled them off because he knew that if they had day jobs, they wouldn't get it done. So for 2 years, this is all they did. Again, this was their job. But that's really, really important for getting these things done. And think about the Olympics. Well, you know, for something like the Olympics, then you get the best people together with commercial experiences. They're just on that. Why don't we do that sort of thing for much more government projects? And in Australia, what they decided after the Sydney Olympics was, if the Olympics works really well like that, let's try that model for a lot of big projects. And that's what they've done now in both Melbourne and Sydney. So that's the essence of the presentation. Two things to keep in mind. We're in this period right now where trust in government is at an all-time low. And country after country, people just don't believe we can get these things done. And whether you're a conservative who wants to reduce the size of government or someone from the left who wants to increase the size of government, execution is absolutely important. So to get out of where we are, we have to do two things well. Choose wisely which things we decide to address from a public policy perspective, and then we need to execute against them well. So thank you very much.
I think we've got a bit of time for questions and answers, so I would encourage anyone to just say who they are and where they're from.
And if you want to disagree, argue, debate, anything.
Well, I want to, my name is Martin Cassini. I have this little organisation called Fit Roads. I campaign for traffic system reform from the very basis of traffic control upwards. I think it's based on a fatal flaw, priority, which is antisocial. It negates our desire as social beings to take it in turns, and it confers superior rights on main roads at the expense of sidewalk traffic and pedestrians, thereby producing need, in quotes, for lights, traffic signals, to interrupt the priority streams of traffic. So if you take away priority, you remove the need for lights and the need for speed. My big objection to congestion charging is that it was imposed before deregulation of the traffic, the reform, the traffic control system was even tried. So I find it a kind of an odious imposition on our freedom of movement, freedom to have discretion. We're uniquely equipped as human beings, highly evolved beings to negotiate safe, efficient movement. And this system gets put
So
in
you must like driving in Sicily, huh? that's what you like.
Okay, look,
No rules, screw those, come on, we just need everyone to be able to drive like Mario and drive.
I mean, look, equality, priority should be replaced by equality. I did have a specific question, rather than sort of go on about my own thing. Very early on, I just wanted you to clarify, in your initial list of items, you need a good idea, you need a design, democratic approval, and implementation plan. What was the difference between design and implementation plan? Do you mind just talking about that?
Design and implementation. In other words, so you've got, actually, when you think about design, there's really two elements of design. One is the policy design, and then you've got the program design, which is it's a little bit different. And what happens is that, as I mentioned, in the policy design stage, which is all about, a whole set of people who are kind of looking at policy options, and they're doing kind of mapping the different things that they could do. They're kind of reaching out to policy entrepreneurs maybe, but that's too often disconnected from the implementation. And what we need to be doing essentially to have success is having a diverse group where you've got policy designers in there, but also some implementers that are part of that team is one way of doing it. There's a whole bunch of other ways to make sure you have kind of an execution mindset when you're doing design. And that was my main point. Because so they did the design of congestion pricing was actually mostly done during the campaign and a little bit before. And then they mostly adopted the roll call report later on. So that was a different phase implementation. What I'm trying to do is say that we need to bring those together a lot more closely.
You need a fixer, you need a kind of inspirer and a fixer.
Yeah, and they're often, they can't be, it's too separated today.
Yeah.
Yes.
Bridget Rosewell, I was Ken Livingston's chief economist, and
You were who?
I was Ken Livingston's chief economist, and I'm now chief economic advisor to Boris. So I've got London experience, and had to do, I think, 6 annual reports on the impact of the congestion charge. So, but I don't want to talk about that. What I'm interested in is this design part.
Okay.
And the mechanisms by which you actually can create a process in an existing political environment,
Right.
that can create a successful design process. Because if I think, for example, about the processes by which we make decisions about transport investments, mired in bureaucracy, methodologies developed over 30 years, if we think about planning processes for big projects or small projects, again, mired in bureaucracy, mired in process, mired in a way of how we do things around here. And I'm kind of interested in how you think this kind of way of thinking could cut through some of those very strongly embedded. I think congestion charge is easy in that respect. It was kind of new and different. It could be sat out there. Crossrail, another example that I worked on intensively for all the years that I was working with Ken, much more difficult in the context of how you built that political consensus and support, which enabled you to then kind of go to the implementation phase. And even now, you've still got politicians muddling their fingers in all of that. How does this work when you've already got a lot of process which is embedded in the system that you're operating within?
Wow, that's a very, very good question. I would say, first of all, that I think some of that early on lies in the ideation process, where by actually doing a lot of these, and I don't want to, this book is about a process approach to it, but you already have a lot of processes in place. But it's really about using certain tools and techniques at early stages, and what that's going to do is reduce your implementation risk, but also increase the chances of getting more people politically kind of aligned. Because right now, at those early stages, we mostly think about political risk. And then we think about implementation risk later on, and that's the big problem. The more you can do with these things, so the more you actually use techniques of, I think some of the latest techniques of consultation and bringing in diversity of views and doing things like crowdsourcing to the public or to people who are working on the lines, what you can do is surface a lot of those issues, potential problems that people might know about but aren't always surfaced to the leadership. And I think that's one thing. But for big, I mean, I think one of the things we need to look at for some of these big kind of projects and processes that have been going on for years and years is looking at reevaluation of them. And to be looking at, are these even working at all? Do we just completely need to stop them and set up some parallel systems? I mean, I think one of the big issues we have in government is if I'm in the private sector, if you've got a company or something which has been kind of lumbering along for years and years, what leads to innovation is VCs will fund a lot of small firms who come up with other ideas who will act as disruptors, and they'll start to get some of the market interest over there, and they'll start to get customers, and then they'll have to pay attention. They'll have to start changing those things and moving faster. And then we don't have the equivalent necessarily in government, and so that's why I think sometimes these parallel structures and institutions can act in that way of forcing some of that change to occur more slowly, so you're not so marred in process. But when we talk about this, what everyone says is this. They say, well, a member of Congress, a minister, a governor, they say, we don't want results right away. They want to announce something. They don't want 4 years, 5 years of pilot projects and this and that, and they just believe it's going to bog down. But in fact, what we know about doing design, design thinking has become a whole big tool in the private sector, and it's about thinking of design in a different way and doing rapid prototyping, doing rapid iteration, using things, whether it's like simulations through things like video gaming, games, or using scenario analysis, or doing a lot of little experiments where you're actually hitting the real world and seeing how that's going to react. And those can be done very, very quickly. And you can be getting rapid feedback, and you've been using social media mechanisms to do that. So let's look at one thing in big projects like this. What we often will find in big IT projects and other projects is that if we had a group of people in the room and I'm the CIO and everyone's running different projects, everyone will kind of say, oh, the project's going great, everything's going really well. And then half of the projects or more failed. So how do you instead surface that? The guy who's now the CIO for President Obama used to be the CIO for the city of Washington, D.C., and he found this as a big problem. So he set up a stock market essentially gave every IT project got a little stock symbol, and then everyone is able to essentially buy and sell stock in those different projects. And then there's different rewards and so forth. And he had a dashboard on his screen you look at every day. And you can see the ones that people didn't believe were going to come in on time or on budget by that, and it surfaced it. What they did was they just locked off the bottom third at a time. They said, obviously, the wisdom of the crowd says that this is going to fail. But there's no way to bring that forward ahead of time. And I think for a lot of these other big projects, we need to look at ways of bringing some of that underlying kind of wisdom out into the open and then making some of those tough decisions. I'm not sure I completely understood the answer. It was a tough question. But yes.
I'm the chairman of another think tank called the Centre for Cities. We might not be as hot as Policy Exchange in London, but I think we're quite hot in Birmingham and Liverpool. Are there any different approaches, principles to cutting spending out of the system? What you're talking about is setting up new things, congestion trend schemes, whatever. But would you highlight any different principles, any different elements of your sequenced approach when it comes to taking stuff out of the system, taking process and programs and funding out?
Yeah, and I would say, one of the things that we're actually doing a study right now, we're applying our framework to cost reduction phase, and a lot of the initiatives we looked at were actually big kind of enterprise-wide cost reduction initiatives. And I've actually been working in that area for 2 decades now. As Neil mentioned, I ran something called a performance review in Texas, which was the precursor to Al Gore's National Performance Review, which we heard about. And our job was to find $500 million to $1 billion more of cost savings every year, essentially. So I was very, very popular within the different agencies, as you can imagine. But we had a staff of 30 people. We're just designed to do that. And I think, this is a long sort of answer, but I think right now, in the position that we're in now, the way to think about it, maybe in a broad way, is that countries, the UK and other countries, were essentially facing this point where there's kind of 3 different journeys we need to go on in order to get some sort of cost reduction. The first one is the conceptual journey, because right now, and that's essentially convincing the average citizen that we're in a structural issue, we've got an aging of the population, that this isn't something that's just going to go away, that we're going to need to do really, really serious sort of restructuring and reducing costs over time. Now, this election, more than any I've seen in the election coming up, but the debate here in Britain is pretty far along down that line, and we'll see. Now, in others, just in Canada, and basically they're just waiting it out as opposed to this. I mean, I think they're not even kind of willing to go down that conceptual journey. But you first have to convince the citizens that this is a big issue. And then there's the political journey, essentially, and that's where you have to set up a lot of institutions and things like that to make it possible to actually see these cost reductions through. Because the point of the matter is, I've been working in this area a long time, and you can do all sorts of cost reductions, shared services, you can do things where you can look at activity-based costing and get your finance things better, and you can reduce all sorts of costs between agencies and things like that, but you're never going to really get to where you need to be in the end, because a lot of the big costs are in programs, they're in benefits, they're in other areas that are often politically untouchable. And so you have to set up a political mechanisms for that to happen. Some of the best ones that we've seen is, one of them is the Sunset Commission model. Now, most agencies, they exist into perpetuity until someone actually goes and says, we're going to close them. Well, Sunset Commission changed the default status. It's like choice architecture. You're changing the status, and that means that in the Sunset model, every 7 years in Texas, an agency goes away unless the legislature votes affirmatively to keep it. And they have to go through the Sunset Commission, which is staffed by people who evaluate it. And every year, usually, a number of agencies, sometimes they go away because they don't work very well anymore. And or they're massively, or they're restructured. But without institutions who are constantly looking at that, you don't have it, because you suffer from this complacency trap, because you're not able to see what's possible because you're only seeing what's in front of you. And then there's the last one, is kind of the bureaucratic journey, which is setting up the systems and mechanisms from a bureaucratic standpoint to actually take all those costs out. And what's really difficult today in Great Britain and the US and other words is that a minister might think that they have all sorts of control in their area over taking costs out, but you move towards a networked delivery model. So almost all the services and all the programs, they're delivered down through, through local governments, through nonprofits, through private sector, and that actually complicates taking those costs out, believe it or not. And so you have to set up mechanisms for how you're going to actually get the costs out from very sophisticated and complicated delivery markets, and then also when you've got cross agencies involved. It's a lot harder than you think. The first 15–20% not so hard, but when you get further than that, very, very difficult. So it's going at it in this way, but in that very systematic way. You've come up with the idea, you're doing the design, you're figuring out the implementation, you're figuring out how you're going to get this actually through Parliament. And the one thing you can't do in these things is scrimp on it. Fiscal commission after fiscal commission, what they decide to do is that they're going to say, we're going to take out all this money, we're going to name 3 or 4 people to the commission, you're going to be part-time, we're going to staff it with 2 people or 3 people, and those they never work. You have to devote, to get savings out, you have to devote real resources to find the savings. I had 30 people on staff whose only job was to do this. Our budget was a couple $1 million a year, maybe 3 or 4 million. That's a big investment. Very few agencies, well, we were able to save, 100 times that sort of thing. But most governments are not willing to make those initial investments. Yes?
Brendan Sarsfield. I work for a social housing organisation in London. Have you got your slide where you've got the stages, the Tolstoy and things like that? I was just interested in that one.
The traps?
Yeah. Because the examples you gave us, Ken's congestion policy, etc. What was great about that was that design and implementation were close.
Right.
And when you talk about NASA and putting a man on the moon, they're close.
Right. The other thing about those that was similar,
yeah.
TfL was a new agency for the most part.
Okay.
It didn't have a big culture that they had to deal with, and NASA was a new agency.
So the question I had for you was, looking at that list of traps,
Yep.
where policy is developed in central government and delivered in local government,
Right.
it looks like there's more chance of failure occurring because you're not getting the Stargate to work, getting people to carry things through is much harder. And it just seemed more of those traps were real when we operate like that.
Well, it depends on, see, as you move towards this localism model and as you do more decentralization, basically you're going to be moving more towards where most other countries in the world kind of deliver services. Certainly whether it's Australia, Canada, the US, or others, and there's 2 key things there, I think, is that we find that the design implementation gap is much lower as you go down level of government. You'll find the local governments, because the council members can walk down and see Sally or Ed down the hall and they can talk to them about it, and as they get up, they get further and further away from that. But, so that's a good thing, actually. So you're gonna find some of these traps become less problematic the more locally you have. But the biggest problem that you mentioned is essentially where you're trying to cascade down through multiple levels of government, through NGOs, and through the private sector, these kind of mission and certain goals, right? And getting alignment and all of that sort of thing, very, very difficult. We have seen examples. I've got a number of examples in the book. One is welfare reform, which Policy Exchange, I guess, is writing about here. That was a wonderful example. But so there's a couple key things when you're doing that. Is that if you try to be overly prescriptive at the central level through local governments, it never ever works for the most part. And so what you want to do is you want to learn from some of the experiments that have already been going on locally, and you want to kind of take some of those and ramp them up in terms of overall policy, but then you want to set some very clear principles and make it fairly simple, and then let them try diversity of approaches to do that. Now, welfare reform, the reason it worked We had 60% reduction in welfare caseloads in some places up to 70 and 80%. No one had anticipated anything that good was, because it had already been tried in states like Wisconsin and other cities for 8 or 10 years. And so they were just kind of riding the wave when they passed it. They made it very simple. There's going to be time limits on welfare reform. People are going to have to work up to a certain amount of time. We're going to give people a lot of transition assistance to get there. But it's a very simple structure. You can put it on a couple pages, and we're going to let everyone try diversity of approaches to see what's the best way to get there, and to be kind of a competition overall, because the more people you're able to get off welfare into work, and you can keep some of that money, actually you can use that for other things, and giving more transition assistance, transportation. And it ended up working pretty well, whereas opposed if they tried to be really, really prescriptive, it would not have worked through. And they're able to cascade those simple goals all the way through the system because everyone could understand them. There was a kind of clarity in that. And I think if you try to be over prescriptive in this new environment, it's going to be difficult. But then what you need to do is you need to figure out how do we get best practices and replication going, which is it's very hard in America. We have a really federal system, really decentralized. When things that work really well in one places, getting them done is very, very, very difficult. So we don't have that sort of replication of innovation in government like we have in the private sector. Maybe one more question, we probably end in a minute.
Thank you very much. Richard Harris, part of Community and Local Government, possibly the only civil servant in the room.
I'm sorry?
I'm possibly the only civil servant in the room.
And which government are you from?
Oh, this one. Department for Communities and Local Government.
Okay.
I'm nervous about the fact that this whole thing is being recorded. It's great to hear that government can do things right, especially in this country where over the last 100 years we've seen the Zeppelin Z101 project, the British groundnut project in Tanzania, the Channel Tunnel, Rail Link, the Concorde, all go disastrously wrong. To hear that actually government can do things well. My question is actually very straightforward. I'm a civil servant who wants to kind of continue this career. I've enjoyed it up till now. If I invest £20 in your book, what's the return on my investment? Because it seems to me that everything you've talked about is great in terms of 2020 hindsight. Will it make me a better civil servant? Will I get a promotion out of this, or?
It's funny. I will answer the way a Canadian deputy minister said it to me, who had read the book, and he introduced me, and it was wonderful. He said, to his other colleagues, he said, you all should read this book because it's like Machiavelli's The Prince for bureaucrats. And what it is but we didn't write something where we say, if you just do these 5 things in this way, everything's going to be great and always end well. Because what we say is it's not like one of those kind of diet books where you can still keep eating all you want and lose weight, right? And that's the business books that do the best, but that's unfair. But if you kind of follow these processes and follow these models, you're going to have more success at every stage. You're going to reduce the chances of failure, just about guaranteed. And the other thing is, what we're trying to do in the book was a lot of people, senior executives in government like it because we're kind of telling some of it from their perspective and getting that out, how difficult it is. But we got it. We both worked in government. We've both been there. We've seen it. But what we also want to do is kind of give something where the political folk can understand better, the other side, and the two sides can understand each other more clearly to come to fix some of these issues, which have been endemic in many countries for many years. So I would say you should buy it, but you should buy a couple copies and give it to your minister. Anyway.
Which excellent sales pitch at the very end. There are copies of the book, of course, at the back if you want to come with some drinks back too. Bill, fantastic presentation, brilliant slides. So we'll probably dream about it this evening. And thank you so much for coming to Policy Exchange. Thank you.
Thank you.